In 2.4, one of the most drastic changes was Druid Shapeshifting, from attack speed to the functionality of each of the forms, and while I personally have mixed feelings about its impact on post-game content, in terms of doing solo self-found runs, it is overall a decent improvement, even if it did end up reducing item diversity in the end game. So today we look at the foundations of these skills: Lycanthropy, Werewolf, and Werebear. Starting with Lycanthropy, since it's easily the most simple, we have a skill that simply boosts life and duration effects of Shapeshifting, that oddly has Werewolf as a prerequisite rather than the other way around, which, let's be honest, is weird and backwards, but I guess it's fine. This does come on the Runeward Beast, as well as the Barbarian Unique, that are used for shapeshifting off-class, though with the changes to the shapeshifting forms, the value of this is slightly diminished compared to previous versions of the game. Though if you do use it, you will want to get some extra plus skills to get the duration and life boost up to a reasonable level. As far as the forms themselves, there's a few quirks they both share, such as transforming to human form with 1 HP right after you die in werewolf form, as well as not being able to cast most spells in this form, though as of 2.4, they at least now have access to more non-shapeshift skills than before, with the addition of Cyclone armor and Hurricane while shifted, though the amount of value you get from these will greatly vary based on your chosen builds. Of course, they still keep the ability to summon and use their in-form skills, as well as stuff like Town Portal in shifted form, but that goes without saying. Now with Werebear, you gain the ability to use skills like Maul and Shockwave in addition to the shared skills of Fireclaw and Hunger. And now that off-weapon attack speeds have a more significant impact on the forms, the gear shift for the form is drastically different than builds prior to this patch, and more in line with standard melee builds of other characters, unless you're going for something very specific. This is especially true now that they've shifted the Werebear to a slightly slower and steady form than before, with increased damage and defense even compared to previous versions, as well as a new addition of uninterruptible attacks, which can be useful, but not the most necessary thing ever, sadly. Now, the Werebear can get up to a reasonable speed, but it does cap out slightly slower than previous extreme speed builds on earlier versions. And with the change to Maul, it may even be more reasonable to reach these new top speeds, but they're not going to be, say, your 4-frame Hungers or anything. The Werewolf also got a similar change to how its attack speed works, but with the caps is slightly faster than the Werebear now, along with maintaining its slightly more speed-friendly charge-up skill in the form of Feral Rage. It has good speed attack with Fury, and also the sadly still underpowered Rabies, along with the shared skills Fireclaw and Hunger, of course, with most people using Fireclaw on either form as their big elemental damage source, then using physical attacks as appropriate. As far as changes to Werewolf beyond the attack speed, it has remained mostly the same in terms of the actual shapeshift skill, with the attack rating and speed boost it normally had. Now, one of the useful quirks that most people don't remember about shifted druids is that they can do a few weird quirks with weapons still, such as having an indestructible weapon by using bows or crossbows instead of normal weapons, which can help a ton if you're doing solo self-found and can make a decent runeward bow, and you just don't want to waste gold on repairing a lot of the normal mid-level weapon options. Though often you'll find the late-game weapon options for these builds are already indestructible because they're in things like phase blades, or they're just naturally so. On the less useful end is that max frames in the shapeshifted form is determined by your base class rather than by your form. And while this isn't a change, the way the attack speed works and is limited has. So yes, this is one reason why things like the Bear Source using Dream and such isn't quite as fun and fluid as it used to be. It's still fine, it's just not as good, and you also have similar issues for the Bear Barb and such as well. So keep in mind, mileage on older guides for using these skills cross-class will have a bit worse mileage than before, even if they're still not bad builds. So, do you ever play a shifter druid? Do you use summons with them? Do you think these changes hit off-class shifters a bit too much? Mention it down below, and if you're curious about the new attack frames, since listing them off would be arduous at best, you'll find a link to that in the new shifted attack speed calculator in the description of this video, and an archive link to it as well, just in case that goes down. And as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye. In Diablo 2, the werewolf has always felt like the more favored druid form, not only by the player base, but also by the developers, packing the ability to use 5 shifted skills compared to the bear's 4, and also being a prerequisite for the skill Lycanthropy itself. So today we're going to dive into what makes this form so special with the 3 exclusively werewolf skills: Feral Rage, Rabies, and Fury. Starting with probably the most frustrating and hard to explain skill of the batch, we have Rabies, an interesting poison skill which can have a few layers layers of fun to it, but is more often fighting against itself mechanically rather than being especially useful. This is because, unlike pretty much every other poison skill that works with attacks, Rabies competes with your own poison rather than stacking on it. This means if you stack high poison damage, you will apply the high poison damage to the main target, but the contagion itself will spread your lower Rabies poison damage to the rest of the crowd, so maximizing off-skill poison damage is not usually optimal outside of specific setups that don't mind the overrides. As far as how Rabies spreads, it's actually a multi-part skill. When you hit a target, you apply two things, poison and contagion, with the contagion being represented by the orange aura latched onto enemies. And at every 4th frame of game time, or a little under 1/6 of a second, any enemy affected by the contagion will launch an invisible missile to infect nearby enemies. When infected, the new enemies will gain a contagion that has a duration equal to the amount of time left on the source monster, and will get poisoned by Rabies as well. This goes on until the duration of the skill expires and is pretty good for softening crowds. This reapplication of poison can do something that no other poison skill can do though, and that is, it can kill a player. This is because it's consistently reapplying the poison if the missile happens to pass through the host body, so unlike normal poison which continually ticks away at life until it's low, Rabies will put a new poison on top of that 1 life player and deal its first tick of damage, which ignores the poison survival function. Though considering you have to hit the player first, it's not quite as valuable as you would think for PvP sadly, but it is there. Into the more commonly useful skills, but one that requires half the time to explain, we have Feral Rage, one of the key tools to the werewolf sustainability. It packs boosted attack rating so you can charge it up easier, and a bit of extra damage to make charging it up a bit less of an annoyance. Though the reason why it's such a key tool is that it provides a double whammy of movement speed and life leech that grows as you gain additional charges, and yes, it can be charged well beyond 4 charges despite the graphics stopping there, though the best way to treat it is getting just enough levels in it to get the max life leech where you want it, and then move on to the other skills. The real handy thing about Feral Rage though is that as long as you have the charge orb around you, the benefits to speed and life leech will apply to all of your attacks. So the common practice is to charge this up to higher levels, and then use Fury in between, just dipping back to this skill every now and then to keep the charges refreshed and working, providing 4% life leech per charge and a reasonable boost to run walk speed, though with diminishing returns as most run walk boosts do. Lastly, in the werewolf exclusive skills, we have Fury, which was an okay skill before, giving the druid an almost zeal-like attack with solid attack rating and damage boosts, but it was further improved in 2.4 by giving it a boosted bonus to attack rating, as well as a reduction in the number of frames it has per attack, though it is taken out of the rollback frames rather than the action frames, so to get the hit will take the same amount of time, it's just the recovery will be shorter, basically like a less drastic version of the change they made to Fend on the Amazon. As far as the attack cycle on Fury, it follows a pattern of slow start, fast middle, and slow end, which results in it ending up being relatively competitive with Zeal at maximum speeds, which are not terrible to reach thanks to the innate bonus in the werewolf form, and the change to allow for off-weapon attack speed boost to shapeshifted characters is a big boon as well. If you're curious what the new action frames and frames per attack are, there will be a link in the description to the calculator as well as a backup link to the archived version. Now, if you're curious about the base forms as well though, a link to that video should be on screen now, and stay tuned for the bear coverage very soon after this. And as always, a special thanks to the channel members, patrons, and Twitch subs that make this content possible. To round out the shapeshifting tree, it's time we hit not only the Werebear specific skills of Maul and Shockwave, but also the shared skills Hunger and Fireclaw. Despite the lower popularity of the Werebear for shifter druids, the form actually provides a great amount more utility than its wolf counterpart, thanks to its more crowd control focus with multiple stun effects while still maintaining a few damage options. Starting with the exclusives, we have Maul, which functions on a similar charge system to the Werewolf's Feral Rage, except instead of speed and leech, we gain damage, attack speed, and stun effects, which scale similarly based on the number of charges, which can range anywhere from 1 all the way up to the mid-30s of charges if you have enough plus skills, with each charge providing 30% enhanced damage and 3% increased attack speed. It is worth noting that even though the graphic doesn't change past the 4th charge, the effect still requires charging up to full, and while it's not uncommon to combine the skill with Hunger or Fireclaw, a lot of people will just use this skill as a main attack, making it much easier to keep at full charge consistently, only swapping to the others when necessary for specific enemies. But if you do lean more into those, Maul does work the same as Feral Rage in that it will continue to provide stun and damage effects as long as you have your green orb. Now, the other exclusive skill, Shockwave, is an extra interesting skill since it's the only wereform attack skill that uses faster cast rate, so having a little bit of faster cast to hit a good breakpoint can be handy in this form. Though remember that the shifted druid actually has better breakpoints than the human form, so it's more in line with the assassin's breakpoints than the normal druid ones. As far as how the skill itself works, it shoots 5 piercing missiles that will attempt to stun enemies they strike in a pattern similar to Teeth or Multi-Shot, and unfortunately, like Teeth, Shockwave has a next delay, so sadly it cannot multi-strike single targets like Charge Bolt or Charge Strike, so you'll find it more beneficial to aim at a wide area by keeping your cursor close to your character rather than further away when casting, to avoid as much overlap as possible, and as such, wasted damage. Like other stun skills, there is a 10-second cap on the stun length, despite it being able to show higher in some versions of the game, and it only has a 10% chance of applying to things like champions and uniques, so against tougher groups of mobs you will need to spam it, but thankfully when used alongside Maul, it is pretty easy to get it even on the tougher enemies, allowing you to keep your mercenary much safer than other builds in the game. This is also helped by how stun always just applies the duration of the most recently effective stun, so you'll keep enemies locked down pretty easily with this combo. On the shared skills, we thankfully have some fairly simple abilities to understand, starting with Fire Claw, which is exactly what it sounds like, fire damage added to a melee attack with a couple synergies in the elemental tree, which you sadly cannot cast while shapeshifted, but on the plus side, it can be combined with Armageddon for some area of effect damage, since Armageddon can be cast while shapeshifted, and it shares synergies with this skill. The only downside is that you are heavily centered on fire damage, though when stacked with Maul, you can get your physical damage up to at least an okay amount alongside it. The other shared skill is Hunger, a biting attack that shares its animation with Rabies on the werewolf, but is the only biting attack for the werebear, and is known for having faster attack frames. Though in Lord of Destruction, these frames were buggy due to how the game worked, causing every other attack to essentially guaranteed miss. But with the new frames in Resurrected, it functions closer to intended. Now, as far as its function, it's a skill with extremely high dual leech, but also an extremely large physical damage penalty. Specifically, it drops your damage by, well, 75%. After all other effects have been considered, meaning it's really hard, if not impossible, to counter completely, but due to the high leech amount, it can be handy to even just have a 1 point in for quick pick-me-ups in the middle of battle, since even at level 1, it's 72%, and with plus skills, you'll quickly pass triple-digit leech amounts. Overall, the bear form is a lot stronger than it's given credit for, despite having access to less options in terms of their loadout. The trick is to remember that it is far more of a control build than a DPS build like the wolf, but it can still bring the hurt to single targets when it needs to. So, do you prefer the bear or the wolf form more? What are some changes you wish Blizzard would make to the shapeshifting tree? Mention them down below, and if you want to see what its main competitor, the werewolf, brings to the table, you can find a link to that on screen now. And as always, a special thanks to channel members and patrons that make this content possible. One tree that got a lot of hype with the 2.4 patch was the Druid Summoning tree, with some fairly drastic changes to the core summons, but also some nice-to-have changes to the side summons. So today we're going to get those out of the way first with a look not only at Ravens, but also the Vine Brothers, with Poison Creeper, Carrion Vine, and Solar Creeper being interesting utility tools. Starting with the cousins of Poison Ivy, it's important to remember that they are each exclusive, much like the spirits, in that you can only have one vine summoned at a time, with Poison Creeper being your starter tool and key synergy for a Rabies Druid. These are basically just simple poison summons, and as such are a fairly low utility even at max points, so the only time you really see them is whenever you're going for a Rabies Druid, and even then, they're usually better off with the other vines. As far as how they work, they'll basically pop up out of the ground and lay down a static poison area that increases in duration with levels and will poison enemies it hits. And while the vines don't get attacked while underground, they can still be pretty easily killed whenever they do pop up. So don't expect them to last for a full game clear or anything like that. Not that you particularly need them to though, since even with improvements and their usefully limited duration on the actual poison, they tend to only beat out mid-tier poison skills for a bit damage since they are summons and they cannot be boosted by things like Death's Web, Grief, Plague, or Rainbow Facets. When it comes to the other two vines, Carrion and Solar, these are your corpse-consuming recovery vines, with Carrion returning 8% of your maximum life for each corpse consumed, which can be pretty handy as a random source of healing, even if it's not super reliable, and then Solar returning 8% of your maximum mana for each corpse consumed, which is a nice pick-me-up between battles to top off your mana for the next group of enemies. Though, since you can only have one active at a given time, you pretty much have to choose between the options, and while somewhat handy, they are only so valuable since the recovery is intermittent, and they don't remove corpses at a significant enough speed to deal with stuff like corpse explosions. So generally, if these two are used, it's as one-point wonders for between battle recovery, unlike Poison Creeper, which does have its explicit use as a synergy for a rabies build. Now, while the vines are hard to hit due to staying underground, our last summon in this video is impossible to hit since it stays airborne, and that is Ravens, which got some massive buffs with 2.4 by integrating it with the animal branch of the summon tree, with synergies providing enhanced damage per level in the wolf and bear summons, as well as significantly improved base damage compared to the Lord of Destruction versions, to the point where these formerly underwhelming creatures are now the basis of some actually viable challenge runs. Now, even ignoring the damage aspects of Ravens, they do have other uses that they've had since day one, the most useful of which is the blind effect, which, while not as extensive as dedicated blinds like Dim Vision or Cloak of Shadows, it can provide a lot more utility that many players just don't realize, especially since you can summon them up as a passive support between packs of enemies, letting you lead in with a blind and a bit of damage surge. Generally, though, I'd recommend just doing a single point and let plus skills do the rest, but if you are going a summoner route, they can be pushed to dealing a couple thousand damage per attack. It is important to note though that unlike the actual wolf and bear summons, the interaction with Ravens is a true synergy, not a mastery effect like it is between the ground-based animals. So while your plus skills to direwolves will help you out with your grizzly, they won't boost your Raven damage, so it's a hard point or bust kind of thing for Raven builds. So, do you use any of the evasive summons? If so, which ones and why? Mention them down below, and as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye. While the Paladin is the king of the auras, he's not the only source of this type of effect, with the Druid able to sneak in a handful of his own, though with a rather unfortunate drawback. It's on a squishy summon that can't fight back, so the question becomes, are they actually worth it in spite of that? Though first, let's get the basic housekeeping out of the way. In 2.4, they've smoothed out the resist of spirits, giving them 25% resistance to everything. Yes, physical, magic, and elemental, while retaining their natural poison immunity. And the other important thing to remember is spirits, like vines, are exclusive, meaning you can only have one active at a time, so you will only want to invest heavily into the one that you plan to use for your build and skip the rest. Now, to throw things a bit on their head, much like these skills do, we'll start with the highest level of the pack, Spirit of the Barbs, the level 30 spirit, which is essentially a Thorns competitor, though with the changes in 2.4, it starts to be differentiated from things like Iron Maiden, which is pure percent, and Thorns, which is hybrid percent and flat damage, this time being straight, flat, physical damage, no percents, no need to actually be hit, just need to be attacked in melee range. Oddly enough, this improves the spirit for use against normal enemies, but makes it significantly worse against bosses, since it can no longer reflect scaling damage to your minions like it used to. That said, with how rarely it was used for that, I don't blame them for changing it, though with the changes to the Druid's main summons, I find myself kind of wishing they had a percent component like what Thorns kept. Overall, you will almost never see people using this level 30 skill, which does not bode well for our other spirits if you're going in blind, but thankfully it is a bit backwards, as the skills get oddly better as we move up the tree rather than down. This is because as we move to the level 18 spirit, Heart of the Wolverine, we now have our actual damage boosting spirit, with plus % damage and plus % attack rating, and an excellent choice for both summoners and melee druids for like the Fury Wolf or the Mauler Bear, not to mention super helpful to similarly combat-oriented allies. Now, the drawback of relying on a spirit for something like this is that it's going to be in the thick of battle regularly due to its AI basically aggressively lacking any self-preservation skills. And while this is true of all the spirits, this is a pretty common spirit on tanking builds, which means less opportunities for navigating them out of the way of enemies. So for convenience's sake, I usually like dropping some points in the animal summons to provide at least distractions to keep the spirit around a little bit more. Though the spirit we tend to have less problems with is the ever-popular Oak Sage, which is interestingly the spirit without an aura parallel, with the closest analogy being battle orders, and it unfortunately follows the same behavior, albeit just for life instead of everything. This means that the percent it applies is going to be based off of hard points in vitality and flat life boosts. This is why you'll notice far less gain from plus life per level sources, as well as plus vitality on equipment sources, which is also the reason why you'll often notice that min-maxing for stuff like PvP or late game builds, people will often favor builds that go towards these setups rather than just getting points wherever they can. Now, another reason the Oak Sage actually does well, besides the fact that it's useful for both ranged and tanky builds, is that spirits are affected by their own auras. So at higher levels, you'll actually find that Oak Sage becomes the tankiest of the spirits, despite having the lowest base life of the trio. That said, they all have their uses, especially if you're running in a pack with other druids, since having multiples of the same aura, at least these types of auras, is kind of pointless due to only the highest one functioning. Though, even outside of that, the choice between Oak Sage and Heart of the Wolverine is a pretty important one depending on your build, since Oak Sage is only additive with the percents from Shapeshifting, not multiplied. So, do you have a favorite spirit, or do you avoid using auras from supremely squishy sources? Or would you like to see the spirits get a little more utility so they don't just float around randomly? Mention it down below, and as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye. To round out the summons of the Druid, we have 3 skills that function completely differently from most other summons, and heck, most other skills for that matter, that also interestingly enough got a significant boost to their utility with the release of 2.4. Though first, let's knock out what each of them do that's, well, normal, starting with Spirit Wolves that shifted from physical to cold damage and even got the associated chill in 2.4, and with the right amount of levels you can summon up to 5 of these doggos at a time, which makes up a little bit for their lack of individual damage, but overall they're just a nice addition for their non-physical damage, which is something that dedicated summoners will lack, and they're good extra bodies if you're pumping them with plus skills such as an Elementalist or even more of a Fireclaw oriented druid. After that, we have the slightly bigger and tougher Direwolves, which are limited to 3 at a time, but do a good bit more damage and are tankier than their spiritual counterparts. And while not a new feature to 2.4, Direwolves also have the distinction of being a corpse-consuming summon. Not in that they need it to exist, but rather, if there's a corpse nearby, they will consume it to give themselves rage, which is basically a 100% damage buff that lasts for about 20 seconds. So while they still won't be much help for dealing with Neelathak, they can be helpful for dealing with things like Fallen, Flares, and even Undead to keep them from being revived. Third is the Grizzly Bear, which sits in a position of being stronger than golems, but not quite up to the mark of Valkyries or Shadows. They're also the most popular of the 3 main druid summons to be maxed thanks to their reasonable damage due to a combined scaling base damage as well as scaling percent damage boost. Combine this with their unblockable but slower Bear Smite that they use about half the time instead of a normal attack, and you have a pretty tanky and useful sidekick. Now, for most skills, that would be all you need to know about them, but druid summons have a number of interesting factors that distinguish them from other summons, such as bears and wolves reaching 85% resist all at level 18, making them exceptionally tanky, as well as some standard stuff such as being able to open doors and having a standard 15 frame delay between actions, and their newfound ability to be able to have all 3 flavors out simultaneously, which helps out their usefulness compared to the Necromancer a ton. But what really sets them apart from summons and other skills is how they react to plus skills, most notably in relation to each other. Spirit Wolves, Direwolves, and the Grizzly act as masteries, not synergies, meaning that the plus skills you get from gear contribute to the bonuses they provide each other. So you don't need to worry about what the base level is like you normally do with, say, the synergies between Fireball and Firebolt, but instead treat each of the summons like how you treat the interaction between Fireball and Fire Mastery, where plus skills go many miles further than with normal interactions. This is why the popularity of druid summons, even as 1 wonders, has increased significantly with the release of 2.4, since now instead of just having all this work on your bear, which was the most popular combat summon prior, you have it working on all 3 core summons and impacting the field. Is it overpowered? No. Is it nice to have? Abso-freaking-lutely. So do you actively invest in your druid summons, or do you prefer having those spare points for your core skills? Mention it down below, and as always, a special thanks to the active supporters that help keep the lights on. Continuing to look at the buffs to the druid, which, let's be frank, it kind of needed, we have the elemental tree, starting with the human form exclusive fire branch of Firestorm, Molten Boulder, Fissure, and Volcano, which previous to 2.4 was pretty much unused outside of the early game rush with something like the Fissure Druid, for example. This was due to the skills previously sharing a cooldown, which forced them all to cast exceptionally slow and lock each other out, but with 2.4, all of that changed. Now, with the cooldowns being independent of each other, you are able to juggle each of these skills to create a more consistent wave of pain. That at least makes you competitive with the more standard elemental druid, the Wind Druid. This, combined with the accessibility of fire piercing gear, can actually make these skills even viable for endgame play. Starting with the foundational skill of Firestorm, we actually have a lot more power here than you would likely guess at first glance, since it just looks like a weaker firewall, but an often overlooked aspect of the skill is how the fire damage stacks, making it especially dangerous in the same way that skills like Charged Bolt and Charged Strike are, by stacking on top of previous shots due to a lack of next delay function. This stacking ability easily makes this one of the strongest, if not the strongest, level 1 skill in the game, with the aforementioned Charge Bolt being the only real general use competitor, and Smite only getting a place due to its very niche but very deadly specific use case. As far as the pattern of the skill, it sadly fits in with the rest of the RNG-heavy Druid Elemental tree, with the central path generally being reliable damage to a location, but the other two suffering from much the same problem as Charge Bolt or even Twister, in that it zigzags and does whatever it wants, sometimes frustratingly so. But if you hug an enemy, especially a big one, you'll still get a ton of damage on them. Firestorm is followed up by another nice skill, and one I juggle in more now thanks to the 2.4 changes, and that is Molten Boulder, which thankfully is a fire skill that follows a predictable pattern, and even got a nice speed boost with the patch that makes it far more comfortable to use. Though that also hides its knockback quirk a little bit more, since the skill's knockback effect actually is in relation to the Druid, not the Boulder, so you could use it to side shove enemies if you really wanted to. As far as how it works, it deals physical and fire damage. It travels along its straight line, leaving a fire trail and then exploding at the end to cause some pain. With the increased speed and shorter duration, it will still cover the same ground as before, but do it in much less time, which is fine by me since it makes aiming it a ton easier, as sort of a ground-bound meteor if you try it that way. Despite some quirkiness with the spell's damage in relation to certain gear, it is still a solid choice, especially whenever combined with skills like Fissure or Volcano, where you want an enemy to stay in a specific area. Next, we have probably the most popular of the human-locked fire druid skills, Fissure, which opens up vents in the ground that deal fire damage. And while these suffer from the next delay lockout, unfortunately, they still do fairly solid damage, and can easily manage clusters of enemies without a second thought, which is the main reason it is so popular for starter builds that want to just push through normal. When combined with some of the other changes, it becomes a fairly handy part of the rotating arsenal of the late-game Fire Elementalist Druid as well. Unfortunately, it suffers from a similar downside to the rest of your fire skills so far, and that is it's being ground-bound, so if an enemy is flying over the cracks, or even just on a weird part of the geometry, they won't be hit by the skill. Instead, it will just go all around them, but when combined with an open area and some minions to keep them in place, it can shred pretty much any non-fire immune. Doubly so with the right gear, and there's a reason it is one of my favorite lazy druid skills in the game. The fourth skill, Volcano, is a bit more flexible, but also a bit less filled with utility, except in situations where you can keep the enemy still. This is because while it can shoot over cracks and chasms, it's still fairly ground restricted, with its big advantage of being able to focus fire, unlike most of the other Druid elemental skills. Meaning you can focus a target down by throwing a Volcano immediately under where they stand, and as long as you keep them there, they'll take a consistent amount of damage outside of the next hit delays. On top of that, these are also a fairly useful tool for dealing with pure fire immune, since like Molten Boulder, it is a physical damage dealer too, so generally it is going to be one of your answers to dealing with the fire immunes in the game, especially the unbreakable ones. The big downside of this skill though is it sort of suffers from the split damage curse, meaning it will deal significant damage, it's just it doesn't quite scale as hard as pure damage skills because they're splitting it between physical and fire. Overall, with the big change to cooldowns being independent in 2.4, it turned these skills that were kind of mediocre before the change into actually viable skills that are able to be competitive with other fire builds in the game. This is important since it now opens up avenues for elemental druids to build, though in terms of peak performance, the fire druid will be more expensive, but this is only due to having more unique best in slot options, for their gear at least, that can end up with them absolutely flooring enemy fire resists. So, do you play any fire builds? Do you have a favorite or least favorite setup for the element? Mention it down below, and as always, a special thanks to the channel members, patrons, and subscribers that help keep this content alive and well. On the other side of the Druid skill tree, we have Wind and Cold skills, which for the most part overlap with other characters or slots, so today we actually have a relatively short dive into just 2 Wind skills, which are special since they are some of the few pure physical damage spells in the game, with Twister and Tornado only sharing that distinction with 2 other spells, the Werebear skill Shockwave and the Barbarian skill Warcry. This gives them a handful of advantages over other spells for late game play, since physical immunity is far less common, and there are a handful of relatively budget options for breaking them, unlike elemental resists which tend to require more expensive tools to beat. The fact that these skills are synergized with solid cold damage skills like Hurricane makes it even easier to justify their use, since physical cold immune combos are fairly uncommon outside of certain unique packs. The big drawback of these skills, not only compared to other physical spells, but spells in general, is that they both come from the same school of design as abilities like Charge Bolt, Firestorm, etc., where they have somewhat chaotic pathing that can make them somewhat difficult to aim. So the general strategy is to get your casting speed up, boost your durability with blocking and Oak Sage, and actually get into melee range with opponents while using Hurricane alongside these skills. This is to ensure a higher likelihood of hitting and guarantee you are hitting the opponents with your area of effect skills. Starting with Twister, the little brother and sadly overlooked spell of the pair, we have a stunning skill, and one I use far more than is probably responsible because it's just so good at locking down packs of enemies, at least whenever you can spam them. My favorite combo with it being launching one set of Twisters quickly followed by a few tornadoes, rinse, and repeat. Obviously with slower casting speeds it will be a little more frustrating, but it will still get the job done. Now with 2.4, it got a bit of a damage boost, which makes the argument for using it a bit stronger, and it makes my favorite version of the Wind Druid more fun to play, though it still won't quite keep up with its bigger brother as far as sheer DPS goes, mostly because the Twisters have a rather long next delay compared to other spells, sitting at a whopping 1 second long, and unlike Tornado, which has a similar next delay, Twister only deals its damage and effect on missile, so it can't bypass the damage delay in any form. Though speaking of Tornado, this is a skill that is horribly misunderstood by, well, most people, since it's actually a dual effect skill, despite only having one visual indicator. Much like Twister, it has a big randomly pathed Cyclone that travels the map and deals damage. This visible missile has next delay effects just like Twister and suffers from the second long delay between when it can deal damage with the actual missile and whenever something else with next delay can deal damage as well. Though, as mentioned, it has a second effect, a periodic damage radius that is unaffected by the damage next delay, meaning if an enemy is in range, it will take damage. This effect fires off the tornado every 15 frames, or essentially 5 times over the tornado's 3-second lifespan, once at launch and 4 during the travel unless something stops the tornado's path. This aura effect is why Tornado is so much more preferred over Twister, and more effective at proper killing, not necessarily just the raw damage difference, since the periodic damage will apply regardless of when the target was hit last, and you can even stack multiple Tornado auras on a single target if you have a high enough fast cast rate. Overall, these two cornerstone skills of the Wind branch are a lot more powerful than they look on paper, one for control, the other for just raw damage. And despite some players looking at them as support for Hurricane, the reality is often the other way around. The Hurricane is there to help your Tornado build, not the other way around. So, do you like Wind Druids, or do you prefer your skills that don't randomly path? Mention it down below, and if you want to know more about the hot topic of 2.4 Elementalist builds, check out the video on screen now. And as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye. At the peak of the Druid skill tree, we have the 2 damage skills that, as of 2.4, are able to be used while shapeshifted to create builds like the Armageddon Wolf or the Hurricane Bear, or even the Armageddon Bear or Hurricane Wolf if you're so inclined. This change, specifically for Hurricane, is not earth-shattering, but it does open up a few new build possibilities. The reason this is especially significant is due to the ability to pair these with more Druid-themed weapon choices such as tools like Windhammer for the Wind side and Earthshaker for the Fire side, though these are far from the only pairings that can take advantage of the oddities of the hybrid shapeshifter builds. In addition to this, they both still have their uses for pure caster builds, especially since, even as a caster, the Druid tends to prefer staying in close to about mid-range due to the randomness of many of his abilities. This was at least made a bit smoother in the transition for Armageddon thanks to the removal of the Hurricane prerequisite, so you're free to choose Wind or Fire to focus on without needing to grab side skills. This is extra handy since splitting elements here would greatly limit your damage output. That out of the way, both the skills act similar in that they're fire and forget skills, being able to be cast and having a consistent effect over a period of time determined by your, well, synergy investment, with the base duration being fairly short but not unmanageable. Starting with the Fire side, we have Armageddon, which, while less consistent than Hurricane thanks to it relying on RNG to hit, can still deal out a decent bit of damage, especially with the increased missile spawn rate and area of effect on each explosion. Though, since it is another skill with the split damage curse, it won't scale as hard as you wish it would. Though, since it deals physical and fire damage, it still can usually serve a solid role in dealing with single immunes. Now, there are generally 2 strategies with this skill, one being to face tank enemies and just use short-range powerhouses like Firestorm while human or Fireclaws while shapeshifted, all while just soaking their damage and letting the area of effect of Armageddon deal with the crowd as best it can, while you focus fire on the major threats with your more damaging point-blank skills. The other strategy is similar to Blaze strategies, kiting enemies while letting the Armageddon meteors land around you, generally resulting in a trail of damage behind you. This usually works best if you have a long straight path, but it's still fairly effective in less ideal situations. Barring this, you can get a sort of in-between effect by kiting in circles, but it's still a little less consistent. Moving over to the wind side, I usually only recommend the face tanking strategy because it pairs so well with Tornado and Twister in point-blank confrontations. This is mostly because, unlike Armageddon, Hurricane deals its damage in its radius consistently, with no RNG involved. So kiting an enemy is no more effective than face tanking them just to get the damage to land. In terms of the shapeshifted strategies for Hurricane, builds like the Fireclaw Druid can give you a solid tri-elemental option provided you have a weapon with enough base physical damage, as well as providing an option for Shockwave Druids to keep things stunned and chip them down regularly with the cold damage. Though personally, my favorite is still the Human Caster thanks to being able to pair it with Enigma for telestomping. As you can probably tell by the strategies, both of these skills are powerful, but designed for support of other builds, and should generally be looked at as such since they give you the extra damage to round out your build, but are only rarely your main damage source. So, do you use these area of effect skills, or do you prefer the more direct damage options earlier in the tree? Mention it down below, and as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye. Today, we're going to talk about the two worst skills in Diablo 2, why they're so bad, and unlike most of the other skill videos, we're going to talk about some of the options on how they could fix them in future patches. Though starting out, let's talk about why Inferno and Blue Raspberry Inferno, commonly called Arctic Blast, are so terrible. Basically, in spite of their improvements in 2.4, they still suffer from a few mechanical pains in the butt, such as being size 1 missiles, which are tiny, in fact much tinier than the graphic would lead you to believe. They also lock you in place while you're firing them, and they still lack the raw damage to properly compensate for all of this, since they open you up to way too much damage. Starting with Arctic Blast, we have the cold damage version, which thankfully does chill effects and isn't even that terrible of a duration, though it's also not godly either. With each level, it increases its range, which isn't that bad, but due to the small missiles, chances are, even at a full screen's distance, and even with the chill, at least some of a pack of enemies will reach you due to the limited width of the skill and, well, lackluster damage in general. Similarly, Inferno got a bump to damage in 2.4, albeit with fire damage instead of cold, so no chill there. Even with the reduced mana cost, it's generally still going to have the same issues and drawbacks as its Druid Mirror, though it does shoot at least a little bit further, though not so much that you'd notice. Generally speaking, these are still the two worst skills in the game, but also, sadly, the two hardest to balance due to how they function, since if you make them powerful enough to justify standing still, then chances are they will become as strong as meta options, despite being level 6 skills. If you don't make them powerful enough to justify standing still, then you need to think of an alternative besides just sheer damage to a single stream path to make them useful. Personally, there's a few options that could be considered, but I think the best update for them would be to increase the area of effect with levels, and a number of mods have approached this with a burning hands approach, turning it into an ever-expanding fan of fire as you gain levels in it, much like the multi-shot Balrog or Flayer's Shaman, and it works, at least until things get weird at exceptionally long ranges, but even then it's okay. But weirdly, while that works for Inferno as a solid patch, a potential middle ground option, so we don't have to spray and pray fire and ice shotguns in the game, would be to actually scale the missile size and of course even more damage with levels, which would keep the firing my laser appeal of Inferno as it currently is for some people, while still giving it a lot more utility to deal with at least small crowds. So what do you think should be done with the worst skills in Diablo 2? Mention it down below and maybe they'll get some ideas to at least make it competitive with, well, at least level 1 skills. And as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye. Today we'll be talking about two specific defensive skills and a couple of their interactions. While in a previous video we covered the formulas for everything from these skills down the entire stack to absorb, today we're going to look at Bone Armor and Cyclone Armor proper and how they exist in the whole ecosystem. Though a quick summary of that video is that Bone Armor and Cyclone Armor are your first lines of defense against damage and are hit before Energy Shield, Resists, Damage Reduction, or Absorb, so they take 100% damage regardless of your equipped gear, for better or worse. But will give their all before it ever touches you at least. Though I'll link the video for that at the end for those of you wanting more of a detailed step-by-step, especially whenever it comes to things like PvP penalties. Now, in the actual armor skills, the armors will protect you from their given element until you either leave the game, cast a conflicting skill, or run it out of points. And by recasting it, you refresh it to its full capability, though only up to the skill level you have it at whenever you recast it. So if you say had a skill shrine before, your new one may not be as high quality after that shrine is expired. You can also roughly tell how much of each armor is left, thanks to both of them using 3-part animations, with one vanishing each time you consume a third of the total defense available. Now, starting with bone armor, this is only applied to physical damage, but whenever it's combined with synergies of wall and prison, it can actually reach relatively high amounts of damage absorb, and is especially useful because it's unaffected by the downsides of things like amplified damage. So it can be a godsend when dealing with things like Cursed Frenzy Tors and Stinged Dolls. And while it can be active alongside things like Blade Shield and Cyclone Armor, which make you quite the durable whirling dervish, it sadly is exclusive to the Sorceress Cold armors, meaning you likely won't be using this with Fortitude or slapping it on a bone rune word as a sorceress. Now, Cyclone armor is thankfully less restrictive, able to be used alongside anything. I'm not entirely sure why they made that difference, but it's weird and there. As far as what Cyclone armor protects you from, it's strictly fire, lightning, and cold damage, and like bone armor, applies before stuff like energy shield, resist, etc. Though it is worth noting, it only protects you from the actual damage, not the side effects of being chilled, so you'll still want Cannot Be Frozen or you will be chilled. And while with 2.4 you can cast it in wolf and bear form, the Wind Druid is still the main one that has a special place for Cyclone armor thanks to the synergies boosting it by percents, rather than flat amounts like bone armor synergies. Whereas shifters and fire druids sadly do not get similar benefits, so you will notice a major difference in mileage between the builds, since hundreds of damage absorbed for a shifter or a fire druid just does not compare to the thousands you can get on wind. As far as how it absorbs, it's based strictly on total damage, so 100 fire damage is treated the same as 100 cold damage, and since it occurs before resists, it becomes even more useful than normal if your character's resists are negative due to, say, difficulty penalty or lower resist, though it is still not a substitute for getting those resists and absorb up, because, yeah, once it fails, you are gonna die. Now, unfortunately, there's not much you can do about poison or magic damage with this type of shield, or even certain burn abilities like stamina and mana damage, though combining it with proper resists, absorb, damage reduction, and even stuff like energy shield, you can reach a point of near invincibility. If you want a deeper dive into how those stack up, including things such as the PvP penalty, check out the video on screen now, and as always, a special thanks to the channel members, subs, and patrons for their continued support.